So, you won't believe this. CMT stands for Conflated and Misunderstood Terms. It's part of an article series. It's the 12th in the series that is basically to help with people's understanding of various terms. Language is one of those complex beasts, and people can sometimes get things contextually wrong. So if we think about contextually wrong, there is a specific definition for theory when discussing science. So simply saying it's just an idea would be contextually wrong, but theory as an idea is one of those things that is actually correct. Anyway, let's move on with the article. You won't believe this, CMT Volume 12. I've been trying to think of another way to explain beliefs, as I still hear folks saying they are absent of belief in regards to X, or they have no beliefs. Whilst I'm sure they believe what they're saying, it makes me feel I've failed in my explanations. Rather than spray out all the propositional logic or the different definitions of belief, I started thinking about how something like this might be represented in a database, just for understanding there, I program databases. Perhaps with binary, and then I adapted my thoughts to make a calculation that's a little bit more easy to read for the average end user. I then thought about how we could represent a proposition as a football or soccer pitch, and those involved in the game are the players somewhere on the pitch. So when we consider a proposition in its clearest form, it's binary. It's true or false. It's represented by a 1, true, or the logical notation for this would be P, and 0, or false, and the logical notation for this would be not P. So what I mean there is the actual proposition itself, not people's attitudes towards it, just the actual proposition. So the binary representation on a proposition. If we are to examine most things, they can be split into these binary propositions. They might require further explanation after the fact, but the core message is there. For example, the light switch is on. It's one of the simplest examples of a logic gate. It only has an on or an off position. It is 1 or 0. I mean, think about your remote control for a moment on your TV. You've got that circle and you've got that 1 in the middle of it. That is saying 0 is off and 1 is on. That's what that bit actually means. So it's the same as the light switch on and off. Even if you were to throw a spanner in the works and saying it's a dimmer switch, it is still on or off. It's just got various brightening settings once it's on. So again, it can be represented like this. 1, the light switch is on. 0, the light switch is off. It is raining outside is another proposition. When discussing a type of weather, for example, it is raining, this will be a yes, no, true, false, but it will only tell us about that particular weather, not all other weather types. So for again, 1, it is raining outside, or 0, it is not raining outside. Another proposition, at least one entity that could be described as a God exists, or for the sake of ease, we'll be discussing God exists. In short, when discussing the proposition of God exists, we are more speaking of any entity that could be described with godly-like abilities. More often than not, though, you'll be discussing it on the platform of the omni-god from the Abrahamic religions. But however you are discussing gods in general, that is, the result is the same. Either something exists, or it does not exist. For the sake of the conversation, we will include everything that has an existence as something that exists. For example, if you think God died creating the universe, then we would include it as something like a God exists. So again, 1, God exists, so that means God exists is true. 0, God does not exist. Everyone with me so far? Any questions at this point? Am I making sense, Dave? Oh, we've lost you, Dave. I don't know if we're making sense, Dave, because you're not there. Oh, you're back again.
I'm back.
Well, hopefully I'm making sense, but I don't have anyone to tell me if I am or not.
You're making sense.
Excellent. So, a binary representation on belief. You either believe something or you don't is a common line that we actually hear, and it isn't wrong, but it's misused slightly. So that said, we'll start there. Sorry, Dave, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say it's not the whole picture.
Exactly. It gives you your foundation, but...
Yeah, discussing it in those terms is discussing it solely in terms of whether a particular mental state exists, rather than your actual belief about the topic.
Exactly. So, as Dave was saying, you're describing a mental state about a particular thing. 1, you believe it. 0, you don't believe it. And it's not the whole picture, which we'll describe next. So, when we look at binary propositions and beliefs together, we now understand how a proposition is binary and how a belief can be described as binary in the sense that you do or don't hold that belief. We now have to consider how the two work together. When discussing a proposition, we are trying to look for a complete answer in relation to it. It is often seen that we only hear half an answer and folks don't realise that it's actually half an answer. So, half or whole. Now that we understand the proposition is binary, a 1-0 true-false type deal, we can consider how we answer it better. The idea is to answer both parts of the proposition, not just what you think about half of it. So what I mean by that is, you might think, aka believe, it is not true, but does that mean you think it is false? The lack of clarity can cause confusion about what your position on the proposition actually is, and requires further investigation. This is why we answer the whole proposition rather than just giving a read of the psychological state. So when it comes to answering a proposition, what we are expecting is an answer on your attitude towards both if it is true and if it is false. This isn't a knowledge claim. It's not said with absolute certainty, necessarily, I suppose it could be. Just the direction you are leaning towards. So below is a small chart in relation to a generic proposition and our attitude or possibilities towards it, once having been presented it. Now, I put once having been presented it or being aware of it in there because it's very relevant to the conversation and it's going to be covered in a section later on. So we can see here this, really, really basic table. Okay, so you've got your proposition, so P, and it's either 1 or 0. It's either true or false. You then have your belief position here. We've got 4 belief states that we're going to discuss in relation to it. So we've got A, 1, 0, B, 0, 1, C, 0, 0, D, 1, 1. So remember, 1 is when you have belief. Okay? So in regards to A, you believe the proposition is true, which you can see here, 1 and 1. So the proposition is true, you believe it's true. And you also do not believe the proposition is false. So in the sense of 0, you've got 0. So 1, 0, 1, 0. Quite easy. It's a standard belief towards a proposition, and it can be represented with logical notation such as BP, belief in the proposition. And obviously, as I mentioned before, not belief in not P. So this is this bit here, the 0. You don't believe in not P. For the summary below, this is quite a bit on, this is a positive belief in the proposition. So we're going to give this a score of 1. If we're to think of this in terms of a football or soccer team, we could think of their position on the field as forwards. For B, you believe the position is not true. See 0, 1. and you believe the proposition is false. You've got belief in the position being false. This is the standard disbelief in a proposition, and it can be represented with logical notations such as B not P, and the not B P naturally follows. For the summary below, as this is a disbelief in the proposition or a belief in the negative, we can give this a value of -1. If we were to think of it in the terms of football, we could think of their position on the field as defence. So in regards to C, they don't believe the proposition is true, and they don't believe the proposition is false. This position is known as suspending judgment, withholding belief, or the psychological state of being agnostic. For the summary below, as this is neither belief nor disbelief, it makes sense that it sits in the middle of the two values we gave before, so we're going to give it a value of 0. And if we're going to think it about a football team, their position is the midfield. Now lastly, we have this one, D, where they believe the proposition is true and they believe the proposition is false. Now this is known as holding two contradictory beliefs. It's irrational and impossible. And what I mean by impossible, it's not impossible to hold contradictory beliefs. It's impossible that something is both true and not true at the same time. And just for clarification there, I may even edit the article to put that in. Something cannot be both true and false. Unlike the above, where you're suspending judgment as you're not convinced, this is one where you've been convinced something illogical is true, and therefore you're holding an irrational belief state. The three above are rational belief states that can further be justified as being rational positions to hold. This is just irrational from the outset, right? It should be excluded from the summary, but for the sake of the conversation, we're going to call it the square root of -1. And if we're to think of it in terms of football, we could think of their position on the field as a streaker wasted on acid doing the helicopter with their penis. So, are there other answers? Well, of course there are other answers to the proposition, though they do not necessarily give a full answer to the proposition. Most of these would still fit in that 0 position of not having a belief either way, but with different reasoning, like finding the proposition meaningless or just not caring enough to consider it. They haven't considered the proposition and are actively suspending judgment in it. So even though they do lack belief both ways, they haven't fully considered it. So they aren't really answering it. So if we're to think of it in terms of football or soccer, we could think of their position on the field as folks watching from the sideline. Absence of belief. So absence of belief is an interesting one that I feel is often misused. I explained in detail the difference between not believing something and being absent of belief in belief, don't believe, lack of belief, and absent of belief. In the previous chapter of CMT. But in short, if you're truly absent of belief, it means you have no mental state in relation to the proposition. However, the second you hear any form of proposition in your mind, you start to build beliefs around it. What happens is when people say they're absent of belief, in general, what they mean is they don't hold the belief. For example, if we're going to go with God exists, they go, I'm absent in belief in that. All they mean is they don't believe God exists. They're not saying they're actually completely absent of a mental state in regards to it. It's why it's a bit of a confusing term, I find. So right now, I could have some propositions in my head, and you are completely unaware of them. You're actually absent of belief in regards to them. However, the second I mention them, you will fill your head with thoughts about them and form beliefs of some description. You may, arguably say, well, I'm absent of belief that that is true. But again, I'm talking about the whole mental state in regards to the proposition. Once you've heard a proposition, you will have these answers. So, for example, my name is Joe. My mum caught COVID. I just did a kickflip. I once made a rolling paper levitate with the power of my mind. I have a pet baby elephant. These are, of course, not all true. Some of them are. You will, however, have started to form a belief about each and every one. You might even believe ones that are not true, or disbelieve or suspend judgment over the ones that are true. Again, like I mentioned, there are other answers. You might not care either way and not consider it. Don't care. The problem is people are using absence of belief to describe that they don't believe the proposition is true, which technically they are absent of that belief, but having considered the proposition, they are not completely absent of belief in regards to it in its entirety. Generally, this is done because they think it absolves them of their epistemic responsibility. Either they don't understand epistemic responsibility, or they are lying. Another option there, I suppose, is they don't understand beliefs, or mental states, or anything like that. Anyway, as described previously, to be truly absent of belief in regards to a proposition, you have to either be ignorant of it or unable to understand or process it, like a baby or someone with brain damage. Considering some of the people who do say they're absent of belief, maybe brain damage is the answer. For the summary that we'll get to towards the end, with this belief position being completely absent of a mental state, we will use the value null. Now, if you understand databases, you'll understand that null and zero are two different things. That's why I use these values. But I suppose if you don't, you don't. But again, nothing and zero are two different things. So again, if we're to think about this in terms of a football or soccer game, we would think of their position on the field as someone not even at the game and completely unaware that a game is even being played. So a summary of the positions. I've got two types of summary, as I mentioned. One based on the numerics above, and the other the game of football or soccer. So the numerical summary, it's a very simplistic look at the positions and the logical notation in relation to that position. So I mentioned before, one is that belief in the proposition. So the standard notation, obviously you believe the proposition, which obviously entails that you don't believe the proposition is false. Zero was that middle ground, your suspense of judgment. So this is not believing the proposition is false and not believing the proposition is true. Negative one is that disbelief. So that's believing the proposition is not true and lacking belief in the proposition. Null is that absent of belief. I've put, there's no real logical notation for it there for ease. We could describe it with logical notation, but it probably complicate the matter a little bit. And then we've got the square root of -1, which is where you're holding contradictory beliefs and you're believing it is both true and false, which is ridiculous. So if we're going to apply that to the proposition God exists, we do have names for these positions. Now, I know that some of these words are defined differently on the internet. I'm not really debating them there. I'm just explaining how the logic works in regards to these names. You can use whatever identifier you want for yourself. But in the instance of holding the belief that God exists, you're a theist. In relation to being in suspense of judgment, you're agnostic. This could be one of those things known as weak agnosticism. In regards to the position of disbelief in God's exist, you're an atheist. If you're completely absent of belief, for example, a baby or someone who has never heard of gods, you're an innocent. And contradictory beliefs, well, I've left that as no particular identifier because there could be a bunch of different identifiers. So as I put here, this these might not be how contemporary internet atheists describe them. Just to clarify, I am an atheist myself, and that is how I do describe them, but that's not how everybody describes them. So I did mention other positions, and I speak about them more in Ontology and the Things That We Lack. Now, the football summary, this is to give it more of a visual aid to the real-world comparison of things. So we've got our forwards, they're the belief, so they're up there. We've got the midfield, who have the old suspense of judgment. The defence are disbelief. I know there's no goalie. Leave that off for now. People who are not in attendance, they're absent of belief. They're not on the field at all. The streaker is someone that is holding those contradictory beliefs. And the supporters are other lack of belief positions, right? So the field is the proposition, and these are different positions they are taking in regards to it. That's why I'm trying to give you this visual aid when you're thinking about a proposition. Which I say there. So those on the sidelines are those that have heard the proposition but not really thought it fully through, perhaps because they find it meaningless or do not care. Those not on the field at all are those that have not heard the proposition or cannot process it, be that either due to age, babies, the lack of the cognitive and language abilities to consider propositions and hold beliefs in relation to them, or due to someone having brain damage, or perhaps because it's an inanimate object that is unable to hold brain states at all. So when someone tells me they are absent of belief or describes atheism as an absence of belief in gods, I have to sit there and think, how? Being charitable, it's likely they don't actually mean absent of belief. They mean they don't believe in the proposition or God's existence. This doesn't really tell us their position on the field, though, does it? All we know is that they will be sitting somewhere in any of these positions apart from the forwards. They could even be, well, no, they wouldn't be the streaker or the forwards. They'd be anyone but. So hopefully this article has helped.
Be the drunken idiot by the side.
Yeah, yeah. See, I wish that was my position. It sounds far more fun. So hopefully this article is explained.
I'm sorry, interrupting you.
No, perfect. I wish you'd do it more. It's fine to use other definitions of atheism if you prefer them, or you find you have more utility in your discussion. But what I'm focused on here is the belief states and helping people be clear in their positions, right? So regardless of what you call atheism and agnosticism and non-theism and theism and any of that, I'm not really debating that bit right now. I did use them to describe how they would be described through propositional logic. But what I'm trying to do is this image down here of rational belief, which is belief, disbelief, and suspension of judgment, right? There are three cognitive or epistemic attitudes one can take towards a proposition. It's talking of rational positions. I mentioned 4 earlier in that table, the fourth one being holding contradictory beliefs. And overall, I mentioned a 5th one where someone's completely absent of belief, but that's because they're not aware of it. But if you're actually answering a proposition, there are 3 cognitive or epistemic attitudes that answer the proposition. Belief, you conclude that a proposition is true, then the appropriate attitude towards that proposition is belief. Disbelief, if you conclude that a proposition is false, then the appropriate attitude towards that proposition is disbelief. Suspension of judgment. If you are unable to reach a conclusion concerning the truth value of P, then the appropriate attitude towards P is suspension of judgment. Now, beliefs can come in a variety of degrees, and by that, we're talking about the strength of your belief, the amount of certainty that you might have for your belief. You might only be like, well, I lean this way, but I'm only 5% sure. Or you could be 100% psychologically certain. That's still not a knowledge claim, because You don't necessarily have epistemic certainty, but there you go. And at the end of this article's ton of related articles that I put in relation to it. As I said, I mean, if you want to read this in your own time, it's on answersinreason.com. I mean, if you search Answers in Reason on the internet, it should be one of the first ones that comes up. If it doesn't, I blame Trump. But yes, it's called You Won't Believe This. It should be on the front. Should we see what's on the front page, actually? Just quickly, just to clarify how far down right now it is. Oh, I'm clicking on the wrong page, aren't I? I'm clicking on the stream. So on the front page, we've got that analysis of Caffeine Corner that I posted yesterday, Free Will and Determinism. Now, this is an article that I would quite like to cover off, but I reckon that we'd need a few streams to cover this one off. We've also got You Won't Believe This. So there you go. So right now it's 1, 2, 3, the fourth article on the site if you go to the homepage of answersinreason.com.